Welcome back to Regency Rumors. I genuinely can't believe it's already been a year since I did the best and worst period dramas of 2024, but I'm going to try and make this a yearly tradition because I think with the rise of big budget period dramas like Downton Abbey and Bridgerton, if you want to call it a period drama, means that period dramas as a genre are growing and growing more than they ever have. So I think it'd be fun to do an annual review of the series that come out every year. I do just focus on TV series, by the way. It keeps these videos from being 100 hours long when you try and mix in films that come out every year as well. This video is focused entirely on the best period dramas of 2025, and the worst video is coming out separately. Even the ones that I put in the worst category aren't terrible, and in fact, I enjoyed several of them. I thought some of them were really fun to watch. They just fell short when you stack them up against the real standouts of the year, whether that's in storytelling or thematic depth or emotional impact. So that is why I've separated them out, because I want to talk about the differences between really good period dramas and the not so great ones. Before we start, here's a quick clarification. I am not ranking these shows based on how historically accurate that they are. That's not actually what makes a period drama good. What I care about is something I call historical connection. When we talk about period dramas, we obsess over whether they're accurate or authentic, but in reality, neither of those things are ever going to be fully achievable. The past is inaccessible. We can't know exactly how it sounded or smelled or felt, and records are incomplete. We are not going to know what it was like to really live back then. In heritage spaces, so museums and historic houses and live interpretations, professionals don't actually aim for perfect authenticity. There are so many research articles on how historical authenticity isn't achievable because we literally can't replicate the past. And I don't mean just in things like costumes or the tangible things we see around us, because I know there's a lot of professionals that take a lot of care in things like clothing. They're trying to create a feeling of authenticity, a space or performance that helps people emotionally connect to the past. So expecting a period drama to achieve a level of historical accuracy that even heritage sites don't claim, it's a pretty tall order. That's why when we argue about whether a period drama is accurate, what we're really debating is whether it aligns with our expectations of what the past should look like and feel like, not whether it represents some objective historical truth. I'm far more interested in whether a show feels honest, emotionally, socially, and thematically, than whether it ticks a checklist of facts or whether a button is exactly in the right place. Historical connection is about whether a story builds an emotional bridge between then and now. For me, a great period drama isn't about complete accuracy. Now, changing up loads of historical events to where the story is unrecognizable is different, but if we're talking about, let's say, the Gilded Age, where it's all just inspired by history, but a lot of it's fictional, it's about whether the show helps us recognize ourselves as humans in the past. Do the characters feel like real people with fears and desires and contradictions that we can recognize? Or do they feel like museum exhibits in costumes? Where it stops working for me is when inaccuracy is used purely for shock or spectacle or for smut. Then it stops serving the emotional truth and just becomes distracting. Do they really look like they sleep on a couch in the parlor as opposed to always sitting, primly with a cup of tea? Because when a period drama gets the day-to-day feeling of people's lives right, then history stops feeling distant. And then that's when audiences start connecting with characters. And then the stories start to feel memorable. And then people get interested and want to search online about the real history and who really were these people. And I think that is truly the pipeline that gets people learning more about a time period instead of every single point of a period drama feeling like it needs to be accurate all the time. To me, there are times that historical accuracy is really key depending on the story that you're telling. Obviously, something like Bridgerton, that is not going to be the case. It is more historically, fantastically related, but there are still ways that Bridgerton makes people excited to learn more about the Regency era. To me, that's why I am a lot more open to a bunch of different kinds of period dramas, some that feel really historically accurate, and some that really kind of tout the line with fantasy, but still is that doorway into people learning about history. So, with that in mind, let's get to the best period dramas of 2025, in my opinion. So, first up is Death by Lightning. Netflix's Death by Lightning has been one of those quiet sleeper hits of 2025. It dropped on Netflix in November with surprisingly little fanfare, and honestly, I think a lot of people didn't even realize that it's out, and I'm sure some people watching this video might not even know it exists. So this is a 4-part limited series which centers on the assassination of President James Garfield, and what I think makes it really fascinating is when it's set, which is right in this very messy, deeply unstable time period right after the American Civil War. Well, a bit after the American Civil War. We don't get many period dramas in this era. It was really a tumultuous time. The country was technically reunited, but socially and politically, it was not settled. The Reconstruction era was brutal for formerly enslaved people and other minorities, especially in the South. At the same time, Washington was crawling with ambitious men jockeying for influence, money, and control over what the new United States was supposed to look like. I feel like Death by Lightning really understands that Garfield's assassination wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was this violent collision of idealism and corruption and a country still unsure of what it wanted to be after the Civil War. It stars Michael Shannon as President James A. Garfield and Matthew McFadden as Charles J. Gatto, and it is based on Candace Millard's nonfiction work, Destiny of the Republic. Matthew McFadden as Charles J. Gatto has been one of those performances where I've had to brace myself because I instinctively see him as Mr. Darcy or one of the many restrained, quietly decent, sweet male characters that he's played over time. But I also know that he's had a second life on things like Succession. So I know he's able to play these kind of nuanced, morally gray characters, but I do struggle with it. Gatto is one of these morally gray characters, and he was born in 1841 in Illinois, and he drifted through life chasing certainty and recognition, and he was raised in a strict religious environment, and then he was attached to apparently some sort of utopian sex cult for a while, and I kind of want to look into that because I'm like, what in the world was that? And in 1881, so I'm going to have to look up the community that he was in briefly, but they kind of showed it on the show and I was like, oh wow, interesting. He just could not find a place where he really fit in no matter where he went. He tried being a lawyer. He failed at that. He failed at being a preacher. He failed at being a writer. And yet he never stopped believing that success was just right around the corner for him. He ended up latching onto politics in a similar way that he latched onto religion. He had a bit of a grandiosity, entitlement, and a lack of self-awareness when it came to getting into these circles. He believed that him putting some effort towards politics meant that he was owed a government job. And then when that fantasy collapsed for him, he then saw that rejection as some sort of destiny. And he started persuading himself that a single act of violence would somehow help fix the nation and then secure his place in history as this great American hero. What I feel like Matthew McFadden does such a great job with in this role was refusing to soften any of that internal monologue with a level of charm. He makes you sit with how uncomfortable you feel about maybe some of the mental illnesses that he was dealing with throughout this whole series. There is nothing that feels romanticized about this performance. He plays Gatto with such a level of unsettling, sincere, petty, delusional neediness that if you were in the room with this type of person who was like praising themselves and believed that they deserve something, you would be uncomfortable. And I feel like we've all been in those situations. It is kind of like a Mr. Collins type character who's like, "Oh no, I know that the way I'm saying things, it's flattering for a woman." And then everybody else in the social situation is like, "No, it's not." But he believes that, right? And so Matthew McFadden in this character does really well at showing that. And then the tension of other people around him and how they perceive him and how he doesn't realize that they've perceived him in that way. And it's just, it kind of keeps you on your seat the whole time and makes you feel uncomfortable. But I think had they have done it any other way, it wouldn't have come out off as such a success. I do feel like the show invites you to feel flashes of pity for how unwell he is, but also anger at the harm he causes and sadness at a 19th century world that had no real language or infrastructure for mental illness beyond punishment or just sticking someone into an asylum. What I really liked about Death by Lightning and what I think made it work is that it chose not to show the assassination as some sort of divine, lofty moment in American history with like emotional music. Instead, it kept everything really emotionally human to where you're like, what on earth was the point of that? And felt like there was no real reason for this to happen in that way. And it's not really this sweeping tale that we tell ourselves about, Washington chopping down a cherry tree, right? It's this really clunky, messy point in history that just should not have happened, and yet it shapes everything after it. And I think Death by Lightning does a great job of kind of showing that randomness. Michael Shannon shows a Garfield who isn't some untouchable icon of destiny, but he's a man who's just trying to do his best in a messy system. At least, in this version of Garfield, because this is an American period drama, is this series also a bit romanticized? Yes. It's got a very like American pastoral, idealistic vibe to it at times, but I forgive some of it because of the overarching message. In Death by Lightning, there's no divine inevitability here. There's no sense that history had to unfold this way. Instead, it does feel random and mundane and devastating and kind of quiet. In that way, Garfield's death doesn't feel like heroic or symbolic so much as it just seems like a big waste, not just of a presidency, but of two different men's lives who are caught up in a system that failed them in different ways. Not to say that Gatto, is blameless at all in what happened, but I think the show, by showing both of their perspectives, helped show you how there are things about the system that didn't help either of these men. And then really the big loser was America at the end of the day. I like that critics called this more of a political horror story than a traditional biopic, because I think there are different threads of Death by Lightning that you can sympathize with in terms of the political systems and the things that are broken that we still see today. Ending on that note, Death by Lightning actually reminded me a lot of Manhunt, which I put on my best of list last year for 2024. Some of Manhunt's effective storytelling, I think, was how it portrayed John Wilkes Booth's delusion of grandeur. He believed that he was a heroic figure that was restoring the honor of the South, when in reality, he was also a deeply unstable man who was clinging to a fantasy version of himself and his role in history. Death by Lightning pulls off some of that as well, with Gatto showing how personal grievance and entitlement and his warped ideology fed into violence when a person can see themselves as the main character of history. Watching period dramas like these over and over again, it really makes me feel like history does repeat itself, and that we're watching similar stories throughout history with just different costumes and different time periods. Next up is A Thousand Blows. So the next period drama I want to dive into is A Thousand Blows, which premiered on Disney Plus and Hulu in February 2025. It's set in 1880s London, and it's around underground boxing and organized crime and immigrant neighborhoods. It presents a London that is chaotic and dangerous and precarious, and especially for those who didn't fit in with the status quo. The series stars Malachi Kirby as Hezekiah Moscow, a Jamaican immigrant boxer, Aaron Dartery as Mary Carr, the leader of the 40 Elephants, and Stephen Graham as Sugar Goodson, who is a violent and unpredictable working class fighter. The show does a great job of portraying Hezekiah's otherness in the Victorian era. Black men were often exoticized and compared to wild animals like lions or bears, and it was horrifyingly common in this era. And the series doesn't shy away from that, and it shows the weight of that stereotype. Hezekiah has to navigate not only the brutality of the boxing ring, but also the social constraints of a world determined to frame him as something animalistic and unnatural and dangerous. Meanwhile, Sugar's violence, and he is a very violent character, it's normalized and in times kind of laughed at or maybe celebrated in a way because he's white. The series does this incredible job of showing the precariousness of immigrant life in London. Characters come from Caribbean, Asian, Irish, and American backgrounds, and the show makes it clear how tenuous some of these groups' survival was. They had limited economic opportunities and they sometimes lived in violent neighborhoods, and prejudice was something that was on their backs every single day. Then there's Erin Daugherty, who plays Mary Carr, and she is this so-called queen of the 40 Elephants, and she's over this female crime syndicate. And that's historically based in London's Elephant and Castle district. And she takes them from this like loose group of petty thieves to a well organized daring gang. The real 40 Elephants operated from the late Victorian era into the 1950s, long period of time, and they took advantage of a lot of like Victorians' assumptions about femininity and the way that women behaved in society. In the Victorian era, women were seen as these like demure, fragile, and morally upright people. So no one would suspect them of orchestrating large scale heists from like Harrods and Selfridges and other West End stores. I love a counter view in a period drama of these stereotypes of people when the majority of things like Victorian period dramas show them to be put in very specific boxes because of the view that we have of the way the Victorian era should be. This is where I'm talking about historical connection a bit, where there is a version of the Victorian era that we like to tell ourselves because we've seen it in historical fiction or in other period dramas where everything is very prim and proper, and we really enjoy the kind of ballroom and tea room side of things, and that's how we think things were. And so when we see period dramas that contradict that, we're like, "Oh, that can't be historically accurate. Women couldn't have been like that, could they?" And then the real historical record and how people behaved and the roles they had shows that actually some of the versions that we've told ourselves of the way history isn't accurate. So I do feel like while period dramas are a great way for us to learn about history, they are also a tool for us to have a certain framework in mind of what we think it's like. And then I love when there's shows like this that contradicts the way we see things. In this, 1880s London, there was a lot of immigration. There was women who were not living these prim and proper lives, and they were having to do things like thieving. And, there were these underground operations that were going on, all whilst there was the upper class and people trying to live morally upright lives. And all of those things can exist at the same time in history. And I think a period drama that can do that really well and show that is the best kind of period drama, because you learn so much and it unwires your brain around what you think history should be like. Even though the costumes are a bit of a mess, I'm not gonna lie, there's something very like Western can-ish about some of the women's costumes, but I'm going to put that aside for all of the other storytelling that I think is very effective. Next is Miss Austen. I've talked a lot about Miss Austen, but one of the reasons I think it's one of the best period dramas of 2025 is because it's one of the only adaptations that doesn't focus on Jane Austen's love life and romanticize her as some sort of like sad spinster whose entire life was about being sad and single while she dreamt about love through her books. So it's made by BBC and PBS, and it was a 4-part miniseries based on the book by Jill Hornby, and it actually focuses on Cassandra Austen, which is Jane Austen's sister, and her life after Jane's death. One of the most like devastating storylines of Miss Austen is Cassandra Austen's decision to destroy so many of Jane's letters. And it's something that has had people obsessed for 2 centuries, scholars and Janeites, about what were in those. I think it was something like they've estimated around 2,000 letters that Cassandra burned. And myself included, there's so many people that are like, what were in those letters that would allow us to know more about who Jane was as a person. Keeley Hawes's version of an older Cassandra gives this choice a real emotional gravity that you can connect to if you have, family members that you really care about. I've talked before on the channel about how small budget PSB British period dramas are increasingly under threat and squeezed by limited funding and the Americanization of streaming platforms that often flatten or dilute distinctly British stories in pursuit of broader appeal. Miss Austen feels, even though it appeals to a US PBS audience, I feel like it doesn't compromise on the important parts of Jane's life. And that proves that you don't need things to be overly dramatic to make history feel compelling. Now, yes, like many wholesome 19th century set BBC dramas, Miss Austen is a little too clean, a little too rosy, and it's still like wrapped up in those kind of gentle, romantic undertones. But I do think if we want uplifting and heartfelt period dramas that aren't relentlessly grim or cynical, we do have to be okay with that tonal choice and okay with the fact that not every historical story needs to look like Tom Hardy's Taboo, even though I love that too. What I loved about Miss Austen was how solid the writing was and how thoughtfully it was cast. I felt like Patsy Fernand's Jane Austen felt really grounded and refreshingly un-Hollywood-ish, if that makes sense. I love that Miss Austen had absolutely no interest in turning Jane Austen into the main character of a quirky historical rom-com. Instead, it felt like it centered the love that Jane already had. The deep, sustaining love of her sister Cassandra, the long-lasting bonds of her family, and the friendship that gave her life so much meaning. By showing Cassandra across her younger and older years, alongside the people who loved Jane the most, I felt like the series made a quietly radical point that single women's lives are not incomplete stories waiting for romance, but they are full of purpose and fulfillment and deeply loving relationships in their own right. In the year marking 250 years since Austen's birth, Miss Austen proved that while she was the GOAT at things like enemies to lovers arc, obviously with Pride and Prejudice, it also reminds us that her genius came not just from writing love stories, but that she was one of the greatest writers of social commentary in all of history. I might be biased, but that's what I believe. Next is The Lady's Companion. I love a period drama that tells us exactly what it is from the very beginning and doesn't spend the entire runtime trying to be something else for the sake of like added drama or like grit or grim or shock value. Netflix's Spanish period drama, The Lady's Companion, knows that it is playful and romantic and a bit silly and frothy, and it never apologizes for that. Set in late 19th century Madrid, the series follows a sharp-tongued chaperone played by Nadia de Santiago, navigating romance, reputation, and social performance among Spain's elite. Some critics did say that the show is tonally inconsistent and that the fourth wall breaks are a bit much and the sets are too colorful and the modern language was a bit distracting and that made the show a bit clunky. But I enjoyed it nonetheless. I think that all could be fine criticisms if The Lady's Companion tried to take itself seriously, but it does not. And I think that is very refreshing. I think the stylistic choices felt cohesive in a way that something like Persuasion 2022 did not. That film seemed torn between trying to appeal to a younger TikTok audience and being a serious, like melodramatic kind of Austen adaptation. And with it trying to do both, I don't think it ever landed as being either. The Lady's Companion, whilst the costumes are a little bit ill-fitting, I'm gonna be honest. It leans into this quirky, playful part of the Edwardian era really beautifully and in a charming way, I think. There is this gorgeous, Spanish architecture throughout the show that is a perfect backdrop for a more fluffy, Bridgerton adjacent romantic comedy. And I love the fact that we're getting this early 20th century setting with architecture and interiors outside of the UK. Some of the shots of the historic mansions are just so unique and interesting, and I want more period dramas, not to be mean, set outside of the UK and the US. The Lady's Companion is a period drama that fully understands its lane, and it commits to that fully, and it doesn't take itself too seriously. And I feel like that makes it more successful than shows that try to be everything all at once. I feel like their decision to cancel this after one season was wrong. I am genuinely shocked. I can't believe that they are not bringing it back. The whole situation reminded me of My Lady Jane, which is another show that I felt like knew exactly what it was. It leaned hard into that fun identity and it created real fan buzz online. And then they canceled it before it had a proper chance to grow. I don't know why they do that. I feel like The Lady's Companion stands out as one of 2025's more memorable international period dramas. And that's not because it was trying to reinvent the genre, but because it embraced what already made it exciting and fun in the first place. Well, that is it for me, guys. I think I'm officially ready to move on from 2025 and emotionally commit to 2026 period dramas. This year wasn't bad, but it just felt a little unseasoned, maybe. And I would love to see fewer period dramas that feel like they're desperately trying to keep up with modern TV trends, whether that's through the overly trendy music or romantic storylines that exist purely for the sake of trying to be dramatic and overly romantic. I want them to feel like they naturally move along the plot points because that's what the story is supposed to tell, and not because they're just oh, this needs to keep up with this other TV show. Not everything needs to be cool to be compelling. We don't need these period dramas to be overly cool for them to have really good stories. If there's gonna be a bit of cheese, let it be the good kind. The kind that is heartwarming and sincere and used to highlight the best parts of the past and not to gloss over or romanticize the worst of its realities. Sometimes it's nice to lean in to the stories that, were heartwarming and showed that people were good in the past, just like there are plenty of people that are good today. So what were your best period dramas of 2025, and which ones do you think I might drag a little bit in the next video? I promise I am not actually going to go in on the new Wuthering Heights. I feel like that ship has sailed. I am letting go of the expectations of all of that. I have seen all the costumes now, and you know what? I I surrender to whatever that is going to be. This is clearly not going to be a historical adaptation. Let's just watch it for what it is. But I think when other directors like Guillermo del Toro make a historically inaccurate Frankenstein, or Baz Luhrmann makes a contemporary Romeo and Juliet, or Sofia Coppola with an edgy Marie Antoinette, we gotta let other directors have their own artistic vision. I can just say that means we can officially move Emerald Fennell's Wuthering Heights out of the period drama genre and into whatever weird, stylish, sexed up social media ready thing that it wants to be. And honestly, that's fine. I'm not hating on it. I can appreciate the costumes, the cinematography, the dramatic flair. I just won't be pretending that it's historically accurate. So yeah, let's hope maybe it's got some sort of semblance of historical connection where we as an audience connect with Emily's original story in some way, shape, or form. Until the next video where I rant on this silly little channel, goodbye.